So, welcome to Elgin Museum in Conversation. In this episode, we'll be talking with Neil Curtis, Head of Museums and Special Collections at the University of Aberdeen, who also teaches on the MLitt programme in the Museum Studies. Neil studied archaeology at Glasgow, Museum Studies at Leicester, and Education in Aberdeen. He's very much embedded in the heritage sector in Scotland, especially in North East Scotland, as demonstrated through his many external positions and his varied research interests. He's been Convenor of the University Museums in Scotland, Vice Chair of the Scottish Archaeological Finds Allocation Panel, and is currently a member of the Ethics Committee of the Museums Association. His research ranges from the history of museums through to contemporary museum issues, as well as various aspects of Scottish archaeology. Neil is described by our archaeology volunteer Janet as the curator with possibly the most kudos in the North East and outside National Museums of Scotland. So welcome, Neil, and thank you for being our first guest on Elgin Museum in Conversation.
Well, it can only be downhill from that, so thank you.
So we're going to start by going back in time a little bit to just ask what your earliest memory of or encounter with museums is.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that because I don't have a memory of not knowing museums. My parents actually met in an archaeology evening class, so that all my life involved visiting museums and archaeological sites. But I suppose being in Glasgow, I was brought up in the West End of Glasgow, and with the Hunterian Museum and Kelvin Grove just round the corner, they were part of background normal life. So from there it was inescapable I was going to end up in one.
For those of our audience who are not familiar with your museum, can you tell us something about the collection?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful collection. It's, I originally, when I came to Aberdeen in 1988, I thought I'd be here for a few years and then go, but I'm still discovering things about it. And, it is just astonishing, partly how diverse it is. And how rich that diverseness is. So, my first interest was obviously the Scottish archaeological material, so I got to know that. And then I became more interested in having to work with the world cultures collections, which I think really are the most important part. The collections we've got of things from particularly New Guinea, from North America, from Australia, from all over the world are phenomenally internationally important. And I think I just keep discovering more about them and more about the connections with different people, and it's live connections with people today that is really tremendous. But over time, the responsibility of my job keeps spreading, and so we're now responsible for the herbarium, for the zoology museum, the geology collections, even sort of the anatomy and pathology. So there's always new stuff, always new people. So I don't think I could pin down particular star items. There's always a star of the week for me, and I'm missing it just now, obviously, because I'm not in there. But things like the kayak that we've got that arrived at Belhelvie round about 1700, 1720 with an Inuit man on board, giving his last paddles as he came ashore. He died just after that. And that's a lovely example of something that connects the Northeast to the rest of the world. And it's a nice one because it's not a forced connection. This seems to be that he paddled himself. So it's great that it reminds us that other people are interested in us as much as us being interested in them. So I think that's the one I'll choose as my star object for today.
Okay, that's great. And we mentioned in your bio a lot of sort of variation in what you're doing in your role now, and it's kind of, as you say, it's developed over recent years. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about how your job, and in particular the museum as well, has evolved over the last 5 to 10 years? Because obviously you've moved location as well.
Yeah, I think there's, and actually this year brings home an awful lot to people, that we are facing, really difficult challenges and changes, to unexpected things. So, in a way, I've got quite used to that over the last 10 years, that with Marshall Museum closing to the public, that is, was really sad. And trying to work around that now, we now have exhibition spaces in Old Aberdeen, and that brings new opportunities to engage much more with academic staff and with students. But my concern is that we no longer have that sort of city centre presence where we were so much more available to the public and to tourists and so on. So that was quite an unexpected, in some ways, change. But I think for me, the biggest changes, again, it's all sort of unexpected stuff, but I became responsible for special collections as well as museums. Mm-hmm. So that meant lots more people to manage, responsibility for things that I didn't know about. So, I could now be talking about my excitement about the bestiary or the foundation pool of King's College, and much more of a sense of being fully part of the university. I mean, that was the difficulty being in Marshall, was that although we were funded entirely through the university, we weren't really engaging much with it. And so that's the big thing I've been trying to do, is to, make ourselves of obvious value to the university that funds us. So how do we support teaching? How do we support research? And how do we support the university's engagement with the community? So it's not just the museum doing it, it is the university. So that I think is the biggest change. And from that came the idea of trying to set up the Museum Studies programme, that I felt we were in such an unusual position in having a museum in a university, and a museum with such a rich collection, that pulling those two things together, and I think I was also slightly frustrated sometimes by some of the people who came to get jobs and were interviewing people, and there seemed sometimes to be a lack of spark, that they'd become very professional, but they didn't seem to have an enthusiasm. So that's what I wanted to do with the programme, was to get them a bit more enthusiastic about the collections with museums and with people. So all of that is a big change from where we were 10 years ago, that we were in Marshall and we weren't teaching museum studies, and now we are, and I'm merged with special collections. So what's going to come next? I don't know. I mean, this year clearly has brought going online, and that's had huge impacts, which is again really interesting, that we're now as close to people on the other side of the world as we are physically next to us. So how do we manage that? How do we address digital poverty and not just sort of think, oh, whoopee, let's go online? Think, no, not everybody can.
And have you coped well with this move over to the digital side of things, or have you found that quite challenging?
I think we've coped really, really well. I've not found it too difficult. I have found this year exhausting. I mean, it is the way that I think the common experience that everybody has is that there's no common experience. That some people are exhausted and overworked, and other people have, are frightened of losing their jobs or have got nothing to do. Some people are really comfortable online, some are not. But I think as a team, we've really made a huge shift. That I was looking at the figures for our, social media and website engagement, and as with a lot of cultural institutions, numbers shot up at lockdown. Nobody had anything else to do. What's been really good is we've kept those numbers up, that we're still growing. So that's been creating a lot of online content, running events online. So I mean, it's very much like we're doing just now, thinking, actually, there are things you can do that you couldn't otherwise do.
Yes.
So I'm actually
going to kind of embrace that.
I mean, I am a bit of a naive optimist. So I mean, I think it in a way it suits me that I can do it without being too panicked by it. But it's not been fun a lot of the time for everybody.
And do you see a time when you're going to have more exhibition space, whether that's at King's or whether that's, or do you think you would ever return to a city centre location? Would that be an aspiration?
I think there's fantasy aspirations and realistic aspirations, and it's always trying to navigate between the two. I mean, I know what I'd like, but what I'm going to get is not going to be that. I think I'd like to do more in Old Aberdeen that is, say, tying us more in with the university community, so having more co-curated exhibitions. So we've got our main exhibition gallery in the Duncan Rice Library. We've now got an adjacent space which we've tidied up a bit to have slightly more formal, smaller exhibitions. We're going to be turning the Old Aberdeen Townhouse into an exhibition about the history of the university and of Old Aberdeen.
Okay.
But I think there are, we're talking about Marshall, but I mean, Marshall is a hugely expensive problem and one that, the university on its own can't deal with. And I think that's going to be the key to it, is collaboration and partnership. That I think Aberdeen needs a museum, both for itself as, here is a regional capital that doesn't have a museum. That's so unusual. I mean, obviously we've got the Maritime Museum and the Art Gallery, but we don't have a museum about the region. And that's something that we need to do collaboratively. The other bit, I think, is much more about not being, this is where the internet suits me, that it's not being pinned down to a building. So, yes, doing things online, but also physically, we've got material currently, if I can remember correctly, we've got things on loan to Cincinnati, about to go to Salt Lake City. We've got things in Japan. I can't remember which Japanese city. It's a 5-venue tour. Okay. We've got things moving between Amsterdam and Copenhagen. So those international loans are really important. But I'm also really keen regionally that we should be sharing our collections, so that the stories that we can tell around our collections wouldn't just be come into Aberdeen to see them. It would be something that we can share. So I mean, I think there's a lot of potential for for collaboration.
Okay, sounds great. We've spoke a little bit about some of your different roles that you've been doing. Is there anything that you've been asked to take on that you've thought, oh gosh, no, that's it, I can't take that one as well? Or has each new kind of addition to your remit been, oh, that sounds really fantastic, okay, yeah, really interested in that, let's take that forward? Or has there been any kind of trepidation of, okay, can we take this as well? Is that, I
think it's always both. And I mean, there are so many things. I mean, it's like the shift to managing a team of 20 people in the new Directorate of Digital and Information Services is so different from being, a curator in the museum with 3 of us. Yeah. So that's, trepidation was there with that, but at the same time it was, oh, this is a new thing. So there is a danger of the sparkly new thing on the horizon. Let's run towards that. But sometimes the sparkly new thing can be quite scary. But I've always found, it may just be a naive optimism looking back. I've always found these scary things to end up really interesting in the end. But that's maybe because I just block out all the problems and forget they happened.
So teaching is another big aspect, and you've mentioned the Museum Studies course. So how do you find your teaching role? Do you enjoy the challenge? It sounds
really enjoy
like
it.
You're enjoying bringing something new in terms of the museum studies. So. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's back to what I really enjoy, and I think it's what I enjoy in museums, is the bringing people and collections together. And so when you've got students coming from all over the world and meeting the collections and doing things, that's so exciting. I think there's one point in the year which I never like, which is basically the 2 weeks before term starts, and that's because the students aren't real at that point. And they're just a course guide that's got to be written and lots of reading materials got to be sorted and all that. Once we actually get going, they then become real people, and it is great fun.
Yeah, it sounds amazing that you're managing to fit everything in to your working day. Are you feeling sort of overstretched, or are you feeling everything's it's manageable? Or
yeah, I did one of those stress tests yesterday, and it came out as okay.
I suppose it could be worse. Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, I think it's I do worry that I do too much and not enough in depth. So, I mean, it's like I have enjoyed doing bits of research, but that's not happening just now. Yeah. But where things link together, so I feel with the museum studies and other bits of teaching, that is about emphasising the importance of the museum within the university. Out of that, we get student-curated exhibition. So it is the core thing that we're doing. That is not an add-on frippery. It really is part of the core. So I think I do try to think about, what is of marginal benefit and what is really important. So if I keep an eye on that, then I don't end up with this hole in the middle that I'm failing to cope with.
Yeah. Well, my next question might be a little bit redundant following on from what you've just said, but what are you currently researching?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's nothing that I'm writing just now. There are the remains of things that I'd like to do more about. So I mean, I published about 1911 Scottish Exhibition, and that really interested me. That was just sort of very straightforward historical research about an exhibition that was all about Scottish identity at the beginning of the 20th century. And it obviously has tremendous resonances today. It's fascinating comparing. So there's actually more to do there, but that may be a retirement project, I suspect. Most of the research I've done comes off the work that I'm doing. So that was where my interest in repatriation and human remains came from, was because I was faced with having to deal with things and I thought, I want to know more. And then going through an experience of repatriation and thinking, that's interesting. Now I had to write the university's procedure for dealing with repatriation cases. And so that turned into research in its own way. So that's where I still am. I mean, that we're now thinking more about the legacy of slavery. And how does that tie in with the collecting that we have, the imperial collecting, repatriation? There's a lot of issues around that. So I've not yet tidied it up into a research project, but I mean, that's where I'm reading, that's where I'm thinking, but that's where I'm working. So I think that's where I'd be sitting, but I'm not producing very much just now.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to sort of break this interview down into a few sort of sections. So our last question in this first section is, probably we should have asked this to begin with, but what is your connection with Elgin Museum? Or I suppose I should say, how do you ken Elgin Museum?
Well, I'll go back a very long time when I had a family holiday. I think it was about 10 years old, and we visited Elgin Museum then, and I do actually remember it. So that's my earliest.
It's very unforgettable.
And since then, I mean, it's in a way, I'm frustrated that I don't have more to do with Elgin Museum, and it is one of the things, how on the one hand, Scotland seems awfully wee, but then you sort of think, no, actually, we're quite far apart and we don't have enough to do with each other. So, I mean, I think going right back to, not as far back as being 10, but when I got my job here, the first thing I had to do in Marshall was working with Jim Ingalls, who obviously went on to Elgin Museum, and Charles Hunt on the Encyclopedia of the Northeast. And one of the topics there was C for Cowsey. And for that, we had on display some of the vertebrae that, sadly, a few years later, the National Museum spotted that we had them and took them away. But there was a moment then of connection. I think there have been a number of other moments over time, usually around the Northeast prehistory. So again, like with the Beakers and Bodies project, we did work there and we looked at, beakers from across the Northeast from a variety of museums. So, I mean, I think, Elgin Museum, I suppose basically I'll say, right, number one museum for me is the University of Aberdeen. You can have number two spot in my world.
Super. I mean, I'm aware at the moment that Museum Galleries Scotland have been working towards setting up a Northeast Museum Forum to help hopefully bring those museums together. How would you see that panning out? Do you think that would be sort of successful?
I am wary, because I'd rather that things come from the bottom up. I'd rather it was an organic sense that we actually wanted to work together and do things together, rather than have a regional structure imposed on us. And I think the Northeast is it's not a straightforward region. I mean, I think Moray sits very much between Inverness in the Highlands, and Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire. And so
we're usually left off the map, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to force it into a northeast one, as happened with the whole Grampian region, misses out that western connection that Elgin has. So, you know, I think to start saying we've just got to look at the northeast as our region, not comfortable with, but I'd much rather work with particular museums that on, you know, joint projects. And if that means MGS want to have a way of supporting us and giving us money that is called Northeast, I'll take the money. But I'm much more interested in collaboration with particular museums. I mean, the other one just now is thinking about the Gary Heritage Centre. That there are a number of places which have an interest in the archaeology of the Northeast, and I think I'd rather take something like that and work together on that rather than thinking about all the museums in the Northeast. There also are the questions about, you know, what's a museum? Do the accredited ones only count? What about, you know, other people doing things to, you know, local history societies? And, you know, the Moray Society is in an interesting position of doing both. That I think there's a lot more I'd like to do together rather than just have a regional structure that we all fit within tidily, looked at from Edinburgh.
Well, thank you for the very frank answer. I think we would probably ourselves have a little bit of wariness about it as well, and looking, you know, you can see the benefits, but just sort of trying to understand how it will work and who would oversee it, because you know, it's quite a lot of work to just manage something like that. But I think, like you say, is just trying to connect more with other local museums, heritage societies, etc., and things like that. So yeah. We'll see where it goes, I suppose. Watch this space. So in our next section here, we have some questions from our audience, and these have been received through social media. So the first question we've had is, do you feel that a one-year course prepares someone for a career in the museum sector? So I guess like as a sort of one-year transition course if they've started in something else.
I mean, I think it all depends what you mean by prepare. That it prepares them to begin. It doesn't, you know, it's, I think you can do a lot in the year. It can challenge people. It can get them familiar with the literature and some of the issues that there are. What it doesn't do is train them to be able to do it. And I've noticed that sometimes that, you know, when I've been arranging student placements, and some museums have thought, oh, good, a master's student, they'll be able to do it. And I think, no, they're an apprentice. They're there to learn from you. Yes. So it is very much a beginning. I mean, I know that when I did a 1 year in Leicester, the main thing I benefited from was actually being stuck for months with people who were interested in museums.
Okay.
And so we talked about museum issues. But really my learning came both before visiting museums and after, once I actually started work. I mean, yeah, definitely.
Okay, so what advice would you give someone who is looking to pursue a career similar to yours? So I guess even like an early stage, someone maybe who's still at school, or someone who's at university and is studying a similar heritage subject or something completely different. Is there anything you can offer in terms of advice?
I mean, I think I always say to, you know, people in school, you know, they say, what hires should I do because I want to be? I say, what ones do you enjoy doing most? Do those. They're the ones you'll do best in. You know, what people mustn't do is try to think there's a formula that they should follow. They've got to be themselves. And I think that's the other thing when people are thinking about interviews and being appointed. Often people think there's a sort of ladder that they climb up and eventually the person at the top of the ladder gets it. And it's much more a matter of a fit that, you know, it's any particular job, there's one person who fits that well. And sometimes it's really difficult to prepare for, but what I'm keenest on is encouraging people to be themselves. And then, you know, they'll get lots of rejections, but they'll also get, much more likely to get anyway, the job that suits them, that's really for them. I think the other thing I'm sort of wary of is I get people who come and say, I'm passionate about history. And my heart always sinks at that, because that passion about history usually means it's focused in on themselves. And if they want to be working in a museum, they've got to be doing it, with other people. It's for the benefit of other people. And so sometimes that passion actually is a problem, that they want to do their own research. They don't want to arrange, family events and exhibitions and tours. And it's that doing it for other people that I think really matters.
Okay. And who would you say you've learned the most from?
That's so difficult.
Or maybe in what scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I keep, there's various things come to mind. I mean, like when I've given an evening lecture and taken a box of objects out to a schoolroom somewhere in the northeast and given a talk. And I remember this particularly earlier on when I'd say confidently things about stone circles, and then somebody would put their hand up and say, "Well, as a retired professor of geology, I'm quite interested in that stone." And so it's this constant sense that everybody knows more than me about something. So that sense of starting from ignorance and learning a lot. I think within museums, it probably would be Charles Hunt, who was curator of the museum here from 1979 until now. When was it? About 95, 96 that he retired. So he was in some ways, my first boss. And I learned an awful lot from him, and his curation was always very critical and trying to challenge people and not just telling the conventional story. And that's something I always want to try to live up to, is the challenge that he set.
I mean, it sounds like to be a museum curator, or even just to work in the museum sector in any form, you need to have quite a kind of breadth of skill sets, and it's not just about having that interest in old things. It's being able to sort of engage with the public, with your teammates, being happy to deliver children's events or family events and things like that. So I
still find that when I go down to Marshall, because my office is now in the Duncan Rice Library, or of course this year in my house, but when I've gone down to Marshall, usually the thing is, Neil, while you're here, can you move that heavy thing? It's just the physical that seems to be what I'm actually wanted for there.
Well, yes, of course, all museum curators are also heavyweight weightlifters as well in their spare time.
Which is not me.
Okay, so our next question from the public was, let me just make sure I read this properly. Given the number of varied artifacts from all over the world, do certain items need more specialised care than others? And if so, what form did that take?
I think I approach that in two ways. One is the materials, and that's really more a matter of conservation and the scientific knowledge and skills. So that I don't have. So fortunately, we have a conservator in the museum who can be that brain. So how we store them, how we handle them, the controlling humidity and temperature, all that sort of thing is around the care of the physical aspects of the object. The bit that I think I'm more in tune with, and this is not to say the conservators aren't, but the bit that I can think about is more about their meaning to people. And I think that's hinted at in a sense in that question, that it's not just the things are different, but the way in which we got them, the way in which people relate to them. So, I think most obviously, when this has led to repatriation. So the sacred bundle that we repatriated, I think 2003, to the Kainai First Nation in Canada. Now, that was something that we had looked after. Indeed, they commented on this after it was returned. They said, the university's looked after this really well physically, but not spiritually.
Yeah.
And so, and they indeed, when that was returned, and they actually took me to the Sundance the following year to see it dance for the first time. So they really wanted me to understand what all this was about, even after we decided to return it and it had gone back. But the trailer of this headdress, there was a long red bit of cloth with eagle feathers sewn into it, was about 50 centimetres shorter than when it left Aberdeen. And that was cut off a bit because the person who was wearing it was a wee man, and so they tripped over it. And so that's a very different way of looking after something and its meaning. And that's what I'm increasingly aware of, is just how complicated looking after the collection is. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier about thinking about legacies of slavery and colonization and so on, there's some of the stories we're dealing with are really, really horrible stories. So how do you deal with that sensitively? And yet, at the same time, although I don't like the idea of the universal museum with this viewpoint that looks down on everybody and says we understand, they don't, we've got to have some way of being able to talk between cultures and with each other, and not just saw it up and say, oh, only that person can understand that thing and only that person can understand that. We've got to have that discussion and communication, but it's got to come from a more willing, respectful place than just colonising it, grabbing it all, taking it to Aberdeen and saying it's ours. So
yeah, and I guess similarly, not just locking everything away if we're not sure how to deal with it.
Yeah.
It's not just locking it away, it's finding out, okay, what should we be doing with it?
Yeah. So we have a really nice project just now that we've got some weaving and beadwork from the southeast of what's now the US. And I did a wee bit of background research on that and found that it was collected probably in the 1760s. And this is associated with the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole. And so this is before the Trail of Tears, before the Removal Act. And so those people were forcibly moved to what's now Oklahoma, it was Indian Territory. And so these 10 items are actually really important because they lost almost everything else. They came to Aberdeen at the very beginning of the 19th century, so they're actually quite important to us as part of our early history of the museum. And so we've lent them for exhibition in the Cherokee National Museum, and then most recently in the Chickasaw Cultural Centre. And from that, we're now in regular contact. I was, in fact, I think it was Friday, I was having a video conference with the person in charge of the Chickasaw Cultural Centre, because we're trying to create a collaborative web resource, because the people who are interested in that today are weavers and beadworkers who want to be able to retrieve those skills that were at their peak in the 18th century and have declined since. So a web resource is probably actually better for them than having it on display in a museum somewhere else in Oklahoma. So that sort of collaborative curation is really, really interesting, and that's where I want to see how we can go with that and what we can, you know, those are just 10 items out of 40-odd thousand that we've got from around the world.
Well, I think the last question here we've got from the public is probably one that we'd all like to have. If you had an unlimited budget, how would you spend it and why? I assume we mean at the museum, not just personally.
Right, I'm going to take your word. Unlimited, absolutely unlimited.
Absolutely unlimited.
Right, here we go. You'll have to stop me because it will take over the world. But I would love to see something in Marshall that was in the city centre. I'd put a glass roof over the quad and have cafes and things there. I think Aberdeen could do with that sort of, you know, outdoor-indoor space where it would be not freezing cold and wet. And to have a museum there that was about the identity of the Northeast and its connections around the world, done in collaboration with particularly the city, but, you know, other museums to, you know, have stuff there, to have changing exhibitions, and to also have that as, you know, using the Mitchell Hall for performance and so on as well. So it often keeps coming back to cafes, interestingly, my plans, but never mind. And then in Old Aberdeen, I'd like another thing, a sort of cultural centre that was more exploratory and experimental, working with students and staff and other people to co-curate exhibitions. I think that will spend all the unlimited money, actually. But then, you know, going beyond that again is this sense that I'd like to have I don't know what the word is. It's not outstation, because that implies that, you know, there's an in and an out. But I'd like to be able to share the collections around, particularly the region, because I think we've got quite good recently at working with international loans, but they are so phenomenally expensive. And can we have a way of lending things museum to museum that can be really cheap? because often the big institutions, when they lend things, the standards you've got to meet are so expensive.
Yeah.
So when we lent, in fact, going back to that example of the loan to the Chickasaw Cultural Centre, we took the material out. So I was thinking more as the Cherokee Museum. We took things out in hand baggage.
Okay.
And I remember them saying that they had borrowed stuff from all over the US, and then we were the furthest away. We were the cheapest loan because we didn't use the professional art shippers.
Yeah.
And I was really, ridiculously proud of that. So you've given me unlimited money, and actually I want to do more with very limited money.
Yes.
Sometimes that's a greater challenge, and you do more creative things when you've no money.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think getting more objects out towards the northeast would be great, and just sort of sharing that.
Yeah.
And and even in a way, some kind of reciprocal, if I can speak.
Yeah.
There's got to be lots of things in other people's collections as well that to bring those into to Aberdeen and kind of showcase them a bit more. That would be great as well. So. Well, if only we all had an unlimited budget.
We don't.
Sadly, no. But if anyone wants to make a donation, donations are always welcome to I'm sure your museum and always to Elgin Museum.
Yes.
Okay, so going back to, we've got a couple of quite serious questions for finishing off. We have touched on these a little bit already through the discussion, but can you talk to us a little bit about the current challenges that you face and perceived future challenges for yourself, your museum, and just to throw it out there for the whole sector?
It's easy to think of challenges just now. And I mean, you've talked there about unlimited budgets. Well, it's completely the opposite. I mean, we've all had cuts. And I mean, we are so dependent on the university for funding that what we do as the collection doesn't make a lot of odds. It's how many students come and pay fees that matters.
Yeah.
So I think we're all faced with these things, that where the money comes from and what we can actually control are different. And that's really uncertain. That causes real stress. If there's a problem you can't actually deal with, that's the scary bit. I think.
Are you seeing numbers quite steady for the museums course, or?
Well, actually, it's up slightly this year. Within the bounds of normal, but it is a sort of slightly up. So that's good. I mean, I really do feel for them because it's all online. I mean, normally we have them in the store. I had to do a virtual store visit. I really feel we've got to view the rest of this year as going to be in this way of teaching. But I think that is so much the big problem facing us, is just scrabbling to keep going. I think there are even bigger problems around the corner. I mean, as we worry about COVID, we're not thinking about climate change. I try not to get too down because of all these things, which really are such enormous problems. And I think for museums, the real challenge is not just thinking that there's some natural reason why museums should exist. I mean, they're a weird thing, museums. I mean, they've only been happening for a couple of hundred years. We've had these institutions where we put all these special things in them and expect them to be looked after. That's not a natural, normal human thing to do. It's specific to our culture. And so, it wouldn't surprise me if museums stopped being the thing that matters. But I think having amassed all this stuff and drawn it together into these places, we've got a responsibility for making sure that we see it has a future. Now, that may be returning it to other places, but I think we've got to be really alert to thinking that, culture is changing and we've got to be going with that. But I think there are really important bits about understanding the material world and understanding the connections between people. And those are so important. And this, we're seeing, with politics being so divergent and contested, how do we talk to each other across those? And that's something I think museums can really do.
Just sort of leading on from that, how do you see the future of museums, especially in the northeast of Scotland? We're sort of, I guess we are working to that old Grampian boundary. How do you see, is there a future for museums in the northeast? There are many that are closing, there are, as you said, you know, heritage groups opening their own small independent setups. Obviously, local authorities are stretched financially as well. Do you have any concerns about the future of museums in the northeast?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I have to start from the position that there probably are too many. That there's something happened that meant that lots and lots of museums grew. And I think the model of the museum was too obvious a thing to go for. And I think it's that the way that permanent curation of a collection tied in with doing things for the community became one institution. And maybe we need to think about what is the permanent collection that we really care about, and think about that on the one hand, and then the people who want to do things in a local community can do that without having to take on the obligation for permanent curation. I think that's one problem. I think I think a lot of it does come down to that, is we're not subtle enough in our understanding of what museums are. We try to think all museums should basically be the same. And actually they should be so different, and what works in Elgin and what works in the University of Aberdeen are going to be very, very different, which doesn't mean we can't do things together, but I think we've got to have a better understanding of what our real core purpose is and allow that to change and end if need be. I think that, you know, our museums shouldn't end, but they've got to be much more flexible.
Okay, and our last big question here is, what do you see as the direction and purpose of museums in the 21st century? And is there still a place for museums in today's society? I suppose, again, you sort of touched on this a little bit.
Thinking about that. I mean, I think probably more than anything, the bit that matters to me is going to be more about the people bit than the collection bit. I mean, I'm fascinated by the collection, but I think I want them to be places where people can discuss things, where people can, you know, challenge each other without falling out, where we can, you know, the really big issues that we've got to deal with, we can talk about them, and those collections are evidence of those other connections. So there's an awful lot around the, you know, things like decolonisation, social justice, these social issues. I think museums got a really important part to play, but not as sort of substitutes for social work departments, or it's something different. And it's the ability to come together around stuff that in some ways is a bit more neutral, and we can do that. And that, I think, that's probably the way I want to go, and this is where probably why I set up the Museum Studies programme, because it is trying to challenge and make people think about what museums are and not come up with a quick definition.
Do you think, this is probably a difficult question, do you think people need museums? Do you think we add to society?
What's interesting is the way that, you know, people is different, I mean, everybody is different, but I'm really struck by the way, like just now, with the discussion about the legacy of slavery in Scotland, the way that one of the immediate reactions there was, oh, let's have a museum of slavery. And that's such a different conception of museum than there was, you know, a century ago or even less, that it's that sort of, it's a statement of a topic being really important and feeling we need to have a permanent marker of it. So obviously we've had, you know, museums of the Holocaust and, you know, museum of slavery. And what's intriguing in both those cases is that what we're talking about, there is material evidence of, but is really an idea that matters.
Yeah.
And so the word museum, I think, has shifted to, and I think it's this sort of quasi-sacred role that museums have in Western society, that it's a way of taking what really matters to us and we can't quite pin down, so we'll make a museum of it. And that bothers me because we're going to keep spending more money on setting up more museums about things.
And whether
then
that's
you've got
sustainable as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I certainly feel with slavery, I'm really uncomfortable with the idea of a museum of slavery in Scotland, because I think the legacy of slavery in Glasgow, the Clyde, that's about trade, and the legacy of slavery in the Northeast, where it's really about, I think, is mainly about plantation ownership, is so different. And what we need is using the existing network of museums to tell those different regional and local stories that are challenging, and not just the other official, the latest official version.
Yeah, instead of sort of localize or set opposite that, instead of centralizing it in one place in Scotland, these objects are speaking about a particular region of Scotland as well as a particular subject and topic. And obviously there is an importance to share that story, but perhaps, as you say, it's better in the local environment rather than okay, we'll have a museum in Glasgow which is going to cover the whole of Scotland, and how does that sort of separate? There is still quite a kind of clear north-south divide, isn't there, in terms of.
But there's something in there about the word museum. What is it that makes people attracted to having a museum? And is it a museum as I would understand it? Don't know.
Well, maybe our viewers can add any comments if they have a view on whether they feel that there is a place for museums and what museums mean to them. I think we'd like to hear about that. So.
I think one of the other things, just to round that off, is the importance of place and museums of place. And that was something when I was thinking about a museum of the Northeast, and we're talking about a museum of the North. And I wanted a museum that was the North as seen from Aberdeen. So rather than the British Museum sort of, we'll look at the whole world and, oh, it happens to be in London. That's completely coincidental. I think it really matters where you look at the world from. There are things around personal identity and ethnicity and so on that mean that, I suppose actually because, I'm not from the Northeast, I'm from Glasgow. And I can go and visit stone circles and have some sort of affinity with the people who made them. And it's not that I've got a genealogical link to those people, but I'm sharing the place. And I think museums can be really important in that sense of quite a diverse group of people, but who share a place. And the museums, that emphasis, and that builds a lot greater understanding, solidarity than you would have if you're just thinking about we are ethnically or socially or culturally different from each other.
I think there's that added value to an object and how you're understanding it if you can understand where it's come from, and you can see that you can step outside a museum and realize this is just from here. We have in Elgin obviously quite a lot about the Elgin Town Centre development and how it's sort of evolved, and you can literally walk that high street still and see where things have come from, and I think that does, as you say, it adds something more to the experience. But
at the same time, we've got the connections with other places. I'd be really sad if museums only consisted of things from that place and 12 Mile Road. So that Elgin's connections with the whole world are immense, and that's part of the story of Elgin. It's not a foreign story, it is Elgin's story. And yet, how do we do that when we've got things from other places? So, we've got to share, we've got to talk about each other.
Even every small settlement has those connections when you go back, doesn't it? And it's, every time you kind of start looking into a town, you realise, wow, these people went there and they went here, and we wouldn't even go that far today, and they went thousands and thousands of miles into complete unknown areas and brought these amazing objects back to And yeah, I guess it's a question of, do people bring things back as trophies, or are they also bringing them back to say, look what other people can do, look what I found, and isn't this thing amazing, and let's sort of share and understand these objects.
So that's where I think that restitution repatriation is really interesting, as is the move towards focus on locality. But somehow we've got to do that without denying all those links to other places and sort of retrospectively tidying up our collections so that they get rid of everything problematic and only talk about ourselves.
Yes.
It's difficult.
Yeah, I don't think we want to sterilise the collection down to just what's uncontroversial, and you feel like maybe you would have one object in a museum. Well, we're going to finish off with something a little bit lighter. So we've got 7 quick questions for you, and we're just looking for 7 quick answers, and hopefully there's nothing too difficult here. So question 1, what's the one thing you wish you'd known when you began your career?
I have absolutely no idea to that one. I think probably that I was still going to be in Aberdeen. But maybe that wouldn't be a thing I'd really not want to have known. But I think that's been the biggest surprise for me, in a sense, was that I have stayed.
Yeah, super. Question 2, what is your favourite film or book about or featuring museums or archaeology?
Oh, these are not easy questions. I don't know. I mean, the thing that has just flown into my mind was actually Black Panther, because
Indiana Jones. So.
But now I was thinking Black Panther because of that scene in the museum, where it was about repatriation and restitution, and that was actually quite fun for me to see. Oh, this is made it big time. This is, and so I've since, when I've written about it, I've quoted the film. So I'm not saying it's my favourite, but it's the one that came into mind.
Okay, excellent. What item from another collection anywhere in the world do you wish you had in your collection?
I think what I think we're missing most is one of those massive Iron Age armlets.
Oh yes, those are lovely.
That I really want one of those. The National Museum's got enough. I want another one to be found in the northeast and it to come to us, because we don't have enough about that late Iron Age, which is a really interesting period, what was going on in the northeast, and I'd like that sort of big iconic thing. A nice one of those would be lovely.
Okay. Question 4, what profession other than your own would you like to have attempted?
I feel in a way where I am feels a bit inexorable. That, as I say, with my parents meeting in an archaeology evening class, the idea of doing anything other than what I'm doing is a bit sort of bizarre. But I really enjoy.
Would you have ever wanted to do more of the fieldwork side of archaeology?
Yes, but not enough. Bizarrely, the thing I'm sort of, again, in my mind just now, was when I was at a student, my parents bought a cottage and we spent weekends doing it up, and I got really into plumbing. I really enjoyed that. I wasn't terribly good, and in fact I then did a bit of plumbing in our first flat, and boxed things in, and we had a leak, and we got a plumber who came along and said, "So what did you do? As a degree?" And I said, "Oh, archaeology." So, and I thought you were an engineer. Same difference. No tolerances. Plumber needs to have greater tolerance. So I don't know what that says, but anyway, that's my answer.
Okay. Question 5. What has your strangest request in the museum been?
These really are difficult questions. The strangest request is the one that I haven't yet had. I mean, in a way, all the requests we get are strange. I mean, the people who want to, the objects that I didn't think were interesting suddenly turn out to be in an exhibition, and you think, that's going to be really difficult because you don't have a display case. Yeah. No, I don't know. I mean, just life seems to be lots of unusual requests.
Maybe that's just the world of the museum.
I think it is.
Filled with
yes,
requests. Yeah.
I think it is.
Okay, question 6. What is the one common myth about your profession that you would like to debunk?
Probably that I'm an expert.
Okay.
Because people assume that I know so much and I don't.
You obviously know about every single item in your collection.
Obviously, yes. I think that's the biggest thing, is the sense that, yeah, we know our collections, we so don't.
Okay, and the last question, hopefully this is an easier one. Can you give us a must-visit museum or gallery, aside from your own, that you think people would enjoy or should visit? Obviously, maybe not in a COVID situation, but yes, your favourite museum or gallery outside of your own.
And presumably outside of Elgin Museum as well.
Yes, well, obviously, Elgin Museum's obviously there, but yes, outside of Elgin as well.
Again, this is difficult because I know the ones that I like are the slightly quirkier ones that are, about a place that really gets into it. So I mean, they can range from the and the one I was at last year was the Wick Heritage Centre. Okay. And it was wonderful because it just had so much stuff and people kept popping up and enthusing you about things. But it was great fun, and it was so focused on Wick. Mm-hmm. And that was tremendous. And then we were in Gdansk a couple of years ago on a short holiday, and I was really interested because of the Aberdeen links that we've got. The silver communion beakers from King's College were sent by 2 students who were living in the Scots colony there, so I was interested in that. But there were museums about the Second World War and solidarity and so on, and it was just fascinating the way seeing the Second World War told from a Polish point of view rather than a British point of view. Mm-hmm. So it's the same story, but I didn't realise that Poland actually won the Second World War. So I really liked that way in which it brought me up short. So I don't have, I mean, I think Wick is nearer. Let's go to Wick.
Okay, that's great. And that is our last of the 7 quick questions. So thank you very much. You've been our guinea pig with those. I didn't think they were going to be that difficult, so I'm really sorry.
I think it's
to put you on the spot, you got to think about things. So,
yes, yeah. I think it's the way that my mind works. I don't have clear, tidy answers.
I think that's just the mind of a curator, isn't it?
Probably.
Things all over, everything's in different stores. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Neil, once again for joining us on our first episode of Elgin Museum in conversation.
Yeah, in conservation as well.
In conservation or in conversation, yes, it's either of those. It's been great. I hope you've enjoyed the process as well.
Yeah, that was good fun.
I guess if anyone has any questions that they want to put up in the feed, we can always send them on, or we can try and answer them ourselves. So if anyone wants to add anything.
Yeah, definitely.
We would also, just as our sort of plug here, obviously this is a free talk that's going to be up on our YouTube channel, but if you've enjoyed it and you'd like to donate to Elgin Museum through our PayPal donation page, that would be wonderful, and that'll help us make sure that Elgin Museum can continue to operate and continue to work closely with Neil and his museum collections as well.
Thank you.